I'm joined today by Philippe Assouline, who's a political writer, activist, lawyer, and currently pursuing a PhD in international relations and political psychology at UCLA. He's been heavily involved in combating extremist anti-Israel propaganda on campuses for a number of years, including at UCLA. He writes and teaches on the subject. Philippe, it's really a pleasure to have you. And I already am nervous to have you because the issue of Israel and Palestine, for me, as a secular progressive Jew who supports Israel's right to exist, and I find it crazy I even have to say that sometimes, it's a topic that whenever I bring it up, it is a firestorm from both the left and the right on the American political spectrum. And I know that you've tackled a lot of these issues. We recently have had a study from the ADL showing that 1 in 4 adults surveyed around the world hold relatively significant anti-Semitic beliefs. So I want to start as broadly as possible with you. Why do you believe that in the United States, it has become the kind of default litmus test for progressives to be very strongly anti-Israel in a way that seems to not match views on other countries with similar pasts and political situations?
So thanks for having me, David, and thank you for your question. I hope we haven't crossed the Rubicon where, as you're saying, it's a litmus test now for being for liberal credentials. Unfortunately, it's been made into a wedge issue, and the politics in this country, my assessment is that there's a lot too much gang mentality, if I can put it that way, where people are more concerned about defining themselves in opposition to the other side than looking at the issues, especially when they don't have a direct stake in them. And the campaign of demonizing Israel exploits that. And there's a very active, targeted, I think, very well-funded campaign that exploits, natural feelings of compassion, the natural inclinations of liberal voters, which are more towards concern for minorities, for example. And it exploits that through imagery that already exists in the American conscience, in the American political repertoire. Instead of informing people about Israel, this campaign puts Israel into the categories that, in particular, liberals don't question. And it has a tremendous effect because if you're not conscious of what's going on, having your emotions triggered and manipulated that way is a very powerful thing. It's actually part of what I study in political psychology. And people are turned against Israel for the right reasons, but based on largely, if not overwhelmingly, lies.
And I've experienced this quite a bit being in New York City. I've decided, there's no shortage of events related to Judaism and Israel to check out here. And I find that there seems to be a lack of connection to reality on both sides. Without naming any names, I've gone to some events that will bring in a speaker on the topic of Israel, and it will be the most extreme, pro-Israel, militant, conservative, reactionary point of view, and I absolutely don't fit there. It very often takes on an anti-Muslim mentality. It often takes on an Israel can do no wrong mentality. That's not the right place for me. At the same time, I've attended other types of events here that claim to have more of a balanced view on Israel, and they are militantly anti-Israel. They ignore the incredible double standard around the BDS movement, for example, the double standard around, we talk about the Israeli blockade of the Gaza Strip, but not the Egyptian one, which exists for the same reasons. Is there no real middle ground in the U.S.?
You may not like my answer. I've been discussing this exact topic for a while, and thank you for bringing it up. I don't see enough of a middle ground. I don't see, unless people have some kind of direct stake or they know somebody there, they've been forced to actually do some homework, which is not a given. People don't have the time or the bandwidth to go actually look at these things in depth. But absolutely, I see a lack of any thought-out discourse on this if I'm talking in the mainstream. And I agree with you that the conservative side, on the conservative side, there are way too many people who confuse being anti-Islamic for being Zionist, or being uncompromising and rigid or an armchair Rambo for being a Zionist. And I deplore that, because Zionism, as far as I see it, and I know quite a lot about it, I'm Israeli, I've lived there, is very inclusive in the sense that it's a movement for the liberation of the Jewish people and the establishing of Jewish self-determination, but in no way is it exclusive, exclusionary, racist. On the contrary, it's the movement that gave Arab people democracy, the only movement that gave Arab people democracy in the Middle East. It's become caricatured here as a wedge issue that people define themselves politically by on both sides. On the liberal side, as you know, there's so many false notions going around as accepted wisdom, and it's very, very sad. I think the lack of communication between people of different camps, the lack of contact between the traditional, maybe more right-wing Jewish community establishments and non-Jews, has a lot to do with why people are locked into these attitudes or that are a bit cartoonish.
And I think it's fair, yeah. It's understandable that if people see the only voices that they see that are supportive of Israel are these extreme American, often Christian right-wing voices, I can understand being very turned off by that and thinking, whoa, if that's what they believe, that can't possibly be right. And so I understand that, but the problem is there doesn't seem to be a progressive, balanced counterpoint. Everything I see on the other side is completely, it's further divisive and ad hominem when it comes to Israel, and it characterizes Israel in a way that no other country with either conflicted territories or similar disputes is held to the same standard, and I can't seem to have a rational conversation with people about it. In fact, I've probably lost some friends over trying to have rational conversations about this. When I say, Philippe, well, listen, you know, if you're so concerned with what's going on in Israel and Palestine, and you claim that anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish sentiment is not a factor, why have I never heard you mention Tibet or Georgia or Syria or Armenia or even Ukraine? There seems to be something that is making people fixate on Israel when there are so many other examples that they could be putting their activism into.
Correct. I don't know if it's as absolute as you're saying that there are no progressive cases being made. I try certainly to do it. The reason I think people have been captivated to the extent you're talking about, and I think your description is quite accurate, in my opinion, is a testament to the power of propaganda. There is a tendency inherent in leftist progressive movements to try to help the underdog. And there's been a very conscious effort to frame Palestinians as victims, as perfect victims, no matter what the context is. Now, I find this quite racist to actually deprive the Palestinians of accountability, to treat them like they're never responsible for the choices of their leaders. But this seems to be the current understanding of the situation on the left, that Palestinians writ large are victims. No matter what happened, they're victims. This allows a lot of people on the left who don't want to think too hard about the issues to, you know, feel benevolent, feel progressive without really getting into the substance. And I think it's just as egregious a mistake as people on the right that I just described who use this as an excuse to, you know, pour their resentment of Muslims or Islam. It's a bit of a cartoonish understanding, and I think ultimately the solution will be if Israel starts to tell its story in an effective and emotionally compelling way as well. Not dishonest, of course, but emotionally compelling. The Israeli side is not doing that. It's bombarding people with dry facts or almost guilt, which is not going to work on people on the progressive left. And for people on the right, you know, that's not what they need. They need to be exposed to an Israel that is based in reality, not their fantasy of exclusionary and angry state that you so often hear described.
I often also find that when I issue a criticism of the United States, be it a conservative or liberal a politician or whatever the case may be, never does the conversation go to, let's question whether the country should even exist. Let's go back to how the country was created. Now, when I, as a progressive supporter of Israel, point out, for example, that I think it's very dishonest and a terrible policy and really just something that should stop when we see these examples of artifacts, so-called Jewish artifacts, being found and really sometimes planted in the contested territories. immediately there is kind of an archaeological dig created around these artifacts, and this can expand into something that is a settlement. I am against that, right? I've been very clear that I am against that. But immediately when I concede that, I receive a barrage of criticism saying, see, David, don't you see that Israel should not exist? And with no other country have I ever seen that standard applied, that when we identify a policy that we disagree with, we jump to questioning the country's existence at the very beginning.
Correct. Israel's been put on probation. Now, just a little note, I haven't heard of artifacts being planted, but as you're saying, you can have a nuanced view of the settlement issue without putting Israel's existence on probation. No other country on earth, I think, in history is constantly being undermined. Its right to exist is constantly being undermined based on what allegedly it did at its founding. Part of the responsibility is with defenders of Israel on that. We tend to be, from what I'm seeing at least in my experience on campuses, which is quite extensive, we tend to be apologetic way too much. There is a lot of importance to place on the messenger and the confidence with which we speak. And I think we have a very strong case, in particular from the progressive angle, from the leftist angle, from the democratic angle. And yet we find ourselves apologizing way too much. And the message is, right, Israel should be on probation. Yes, if Israel doesn't act perfectly, then it doesn't have a right to exist. Which, as you know, as somebody who's informed, is a bit insane. If you look at the Middle East now, and even in the last 65 years, and your reaction is to point to Israel in criticizing human rights or any kind of political progress metric, there's a problem right there, right? That's a lack of fairness. But again, I think we encourage it by being a bit too apologetic.
We've been speaking with Philippe Assouline. There are two other things I want to talk to you about, Philippe, but we just don't have time today. One is the BDS movement more specifically, and then further I want to talk about the concept of a religious Jewish state versus a secular Jewish state. So we'll definitely have you back to talk about those things, and I really do appreciate you being on.
Thank you. I appreciate being on, and those are crucial questions. I'd be very happy to talk about them.